Yes.
Just to pick up on three things from this morning, sir. First, SAMO, S-A-M-O, stands for Senior Administrative Medical Officer. Apologies, so many acronyms. Sometimes they slip through the net.
Well, I'm sorry I couldn't help you. I was trying to work out what the A meant.
The second point, on this question of potency and purity, if we could have on screen, please, WITN 3431001, page 32. This is the witness statement of Dr. Snape, from whom we will hear at the tail end of this block of hearings. If we could have paragraph 90 when it comes up. Sorry, page 32. Paragraph 90. The context is not relevant for today's purposes, but we can see here what Dr. Snape says about potency and purity. In the parenthesis, he says, the term potency refers to the concentration of factor VIII in units per milliliter, whereas purity, or more accurately specific activity, describes the ratio of assayed factor VIII to measured protein content expressed as units of factor VIII per milligram of protein. Specific activity is important in this context since it reminds the fractionator and the treating physician how much non-factor VIII protein is going to be infused. So we can see there the distinction that Dr. Snape draws in his statement. The reference earlier was to the potency of the product,
Yes.
which in Dr. Snape's usage will therefore be a reference to the concentration in units of factor VIII per milliliter.
It's the degree of concentration. It's my example of the concentrated squash or the concentrated washing up liquid.
Exactly so. Exactly so. The wider context of that discussion is that 90% of what may be referred to as standard factor VIII was required, and 10% of the higher potency factor.
But he makes the point here that the two might be linked, possibly, in this sense, that if you are using less volume to give you the necessary factor VIII, you are therefore providing less volume of other proteins.
Yes.
Which they're just by the way, but they're there. And so it is also going to be more equivalent to higher purity, although because high purity refers to the amount of excess protein that you get, doesn't it?
That is my understanding, but the two will be closely related. A higher potency factor VIII product may be a increasingly pure factor VIII product.
On the other scale.
But, Dr. Snape, I hope, will be able to take us through this rather
more
more expertly than I
that's
can.
right. But thank you for that. That looks as though there was a proper distinction to be made.
Yes.
Thank you.
Finally, a measure that I didn't introduce earlier but will introduce now. We looked at the MRC paper, Dr. Biggs's paper, that was later enthusiastically endorsed by various meetings and was recommended as the basis for planning. That expressed the amount of blood donations required as the measure for achieving the requisite amount of blood products. The same paper also expresses that amount in terms of factor VIII units. The figure that is given in the paper, and it is page 18 of that document, is that...
Is that PRSE 302553?
It's PRSE 302350.
Right, 2350,
electronic
that one.
page 18,
Yep.
internal page 17. Perhaps actually we'll bring it up, Paul. PRC 302350, electronic page 18. If we can see at the top there the figure that we discussed earlier, 547,540 to 750,000 blood donations per annum. And if we go down a few lines, it says, expressed as factor 8 units, the range is likely to lie between 38,327,800 and 53 million factor 8 units. So expressed in slightly more simplified terms, it's between 38 million and 53 million factor 8 units. Now, I understand that to be a reference to what later becomes referred to as international units.
Yes.
We will see increasingly, as the 70s goes on, the measure of blood donations is dropped in favour of weight or volume for the amount of plasma, and international units for the amount of factor 8 that is produced. This is a translation between the two presented by Dr. Biggs. There are various ways of trying to calculate how many international units come from each donation. Rests on a series of assumptions. So it can't be seen to be an absolute definitive figure. But in Dr. Biggs's mind, what she is thinking about is the need for between 38 and 53 million international units of factor 8 per annum.
Yes, just one other measure while we're talking about measures. I understand there is a clear link between volume and weight if you're thinking of water, which I think is how the MKS system of measurement works, converting from kilograms to volume. Plasma plainly is not the same specific gravity as water, so it'll be heavier, presumably, per volume. Do you know what the conversion is?
The conversion that I have found, and I stress this is a layman essentially looking online to try and make the conversion, I think it's in the region of 1.024 kilograms. But there will be others who are far better placed to be able to make that conversion.
So it's very close to a kilogram being equivalent to a litre.
You will see in Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, when the inquiry legal team have had to do that calculation in order to be able to compare data points, the conversion used is 1-to-1.
Yes.
But it is stressed that that is a rough approximation. And as we will hear when we come on to look at those figures, they come with a lot of caveats, the core of which is that they are helpful in showing a general trend, but they shouldn't be relied upon to be absolutely precise at all points as to exactly how much is being either produced or supplied.
Well, I suppose it might be said that it would give a degree of apparent accuracy, which isn't necessarily completely accurate, knowing that different plasma donations will have different levels of factor 8 activity in them, depending upon how much the donor had.
Yes, but there are so many variables, it is never going to be possible to say this figure is exactly this figure in equivalence.
You'd expect the donations to approximate, if there are enough of them in a pool, to 100% activity, that being the average, but you don't know.
Exactly so.
Yeah, I see.
Returning then to the chronology. The tension that we were exploring between, before the break was between the DHSS and the regional health authorities about who was going to fund the expansion of plasma supply. There was also a tension that was growing between clinicians and the DHSS, and no doubt with their regional administrators as well, about the amount of concentrate that was being provided to them. Two examples of that come from Dr. Biggs. The first is a letter that she wrote to Dr. Waiter at the DHSS on the 23rd of May 1974. And Paul, if we could have that on screen, please, CBLA 40206. What Dr. Biggs wrote is this. It's in response to a letter sent by Dr. Waiter on the 10th of May 1974. Dr. Biggs wrote, and I quote, "I wonder if there is some impression in the Ministry of Health and Social Security that the haemophilic patients in this country are now not undergoing any real inconvenience. I cannot give you figures about crippling because it is hard to say exactly what is meant by crippling. However, many of our child patients arrive at hospital in ambulances on crutches and with knees and ankles so painful that they cannot put a foot to the ground. Elsewhere, I am sure that patients with these bleeds are at home in bed. In the long run, all of these patients will have arthritis and deformity. In the bad old days, this would occur before the age of 10. Now, hopefully, most patients who attend haemophilia centres, about half the total, should at least reach adult life able to walk. Our modest objective is to get enough factor VIII delivered to the patient to delay the onset of arthritis to middle age for all patients." We can take that down. Dr. Waiter replied saying that her colleagues in the department had been left in no doubt of the requirements. And she also pointed out that if money were to be made available for more factor VIII, then it would come at the expense of something else in the health budget. I should add, so that although that letter was addressed to Dr. Waiter, I think that we can see from the papers that Dr. Waiter was sympathetic to the calls being made by Dr. Biggs and others. Dr. Biggs, in the same letter, told Dr. Waiter of her intention to send a letter to the Lancet on this matter, and that was published on the 29th of June 1974. And if we could go to that, please, Paul, it's PRSE 302515. I'm going to read the entirety of the letter because it is significant in the effect that it has on some parliamentary opinion. Letters to the editor. Supply of blood clotting factor VIII for treatment of haemophilia. Dr. Biggs wrote this: "Sir, the treatment of haemophilic patients involves a replacement in their blood of an essential substance which they lack. In this respect, the disease resembles diabetes or pernicious anemia. Factor VIII to a haemophilic patient is literally his expectation of life. Haemophilia differs from diabetes or pernicious anemia in that the missing factor VIII can only safely be provided from human blood. The haemophilic patient is thus indebted to society and in turn is the responsibility of society in rather a special sense. Without treatment, before the middle of this century, few patients reached adult life, and those who did were helpless cripples. Over the past 12 years, blood products containing factor VIII have gradually increased in amount. In the early part of this time, medical attention was centred on the cure of life-endangering bleeding and on the protection during essential major surgery. As more material became available, patients were treated for particularly dangerous muscle hematomas and hemathroses in the hope of reducing somewhat the severity of crippling and delaying the age of onset of deformity. The present, but still modest, objective is to treat all developing musculoskeletal bleeds as early as possible, hopefully to prevent the occurrence of severe deformity in all patients. This form of therapy is called on-demand treatment. Very many of the patients treated on demand arrive at hospital on crutches, in ambulances, and with painful swollen joints. Most such episodes of musculoskeletal hemorrhage resolve with treatment, but there can be no doubt at all that in the long term, these patients will have arthritic joints long before those in the normal population. An extension of on-demand hospital therapy to the home therapy, so that treatment is given by a patient to himself, by a relative, or by a general practitioner, would undoubtedly reduce the damage and also the anxiety under which patients and their families now live. It should be noted that even home therapy is a modest objective when comparison is made with prophylaxis. In prophylaxis, treatment would be given to prevent the occurrence of bleeding altogether. Prophylaxis is, of course, the rule for patients with diabetes or pernicious anemia. Its application to haemophilic patients would treble the present estimated requirements of factor 8. Those who treat haemophilic patients in the United Kingdom have, in the past of necessity, tolerated the chronic undertreatment of their patients and have put much time and effort into spreading the inadequate amounts of therapeutic material thinly so that deprivation should be least damaging. Essential but non-urgent operations have been postponed and are still being postponed. Economy has also been achieved by calculating the dose for each lesion for every patient to the absolute minimum dose. In addition, patients who have been put onto home therapy who would greatly benefit by this treatment, patients have not been put on home therapy who would greatly benefit by this treatment. Even with dire economy, some centres have been hard-pressed to maintain minimum treatment. For example, the treatment of the boys at Lord Mayor Treloar College at Alton in recent years has been maintained against a background of begging and borrowing from other centres from one week to the next. With a school not supplemented in this way, it is calculated that there will be a deficit of about 260,000 factor 8 units annually. There is, in fact, evidence that 90% of haemophilic patients in the United Kingdom receive less, and in some cases much less, than optimum treatment for their complaint. The consequences of this undertreatment include subjecting the patients to unnecessary, painful, and destructive bleeding into joints and muscles. Ancillary effects of undertreatment include loss of educational time and inability to hold continuous employment. The question that arises is for how long should this shortage of factor VIII be considered to be a reasonable feature of haemophilia treatment? Two things, in my view, make continued limitation both unnecessary and unethical. The first of these is the fact that 3 commercial companies are now licensed to sell good quality human factor VIII in this country, and they have between them amounts of material adequate to supplement the present provisions of the National Health Service. In fact, at the time of writing, one commercial firm has over 1 million units of factor VIII awaiting use. The second consideration, which renders adequate provision of factor VIII both feasible and desirable, is the fact that blood can now be collected in plastic containers, which makes it possible to use the red cells for patients who are anemic and the plasma for patients who lack some plasma components. The blood donated in the United Kingdom is freely given by responsible citizens. The best use of this valuable resource clearly lies in the best use of all parts of the blood. With regard to the provision of factor VIII by the NHS, we can say with certainty that we have the skill, experience and capacity in this country to provide factor VIII of very high quality in the amounts required. Why then is there still a chronic shortage of factor VIII in the clinics where the patients are treated? The reason is that factor VIII is expensive, whether bought commercially or made by the NHS. Over the country as a whole, a supply of commercial human factor VIII sufficiently adequate to supplement that made at present by the NHS would cost an annual £1 to £2 million. It is claimed that a sum of money of this order cannot be found from current allocations to the NHS without reducing money spent on other necessities. To make increased amounts of factor VIII in the NHS is also likely to be expensive, since it would require substantial expenditure on organisation of blood supplies, on staff, apparatus, and buildings for fractionation. Set against this financial argument, it must be remembered that poorly treated haemophiliacs also cost a lot of money in their role as hospital inpatients and in receipt of social security benefits. But of course, the financial argument takes no account of the misery and anxiety attached to frequent painful episodes of bleeding, and inability to hold a normal place in school and society. In the long run, it will probably be found cheaper to pay for these patients' treatment rather than to pay for the inevitable consequences of undertreatment. When, as a direct outcome of years of research, life-saving therapeutic materials suddenly become available to a population of patients previously chronically undertreated, there surely should be some means of assimilating this welcome advance. Otherwise, it is stupid to undertake the research in the first place. How this should be achieved is an administrative and political problem rather than a medical one. Perhaps there should be a special fund in the NHS set aside every year for the practical implementation of research discoveries. Perhaps an organisation should be set up to collect money on a charitable basis to supplement the NHS funds available for the introduction of new treatments. Whatever solutions there may be for problems of this sort in general, some immediate solution should be found for the ridiculous impasse of large available stocks of therapeutic material locked up in stores because no one will buy them, and, on the other hand, patients in dire need of the same material. That was Dr. Biggs's letter to The Lancet on the 29th of June 1974. That letter, as I hinted, prompted a number of parliamentary questions about Factor VIII supply and home treatment from Lewis Carter-Jones, the Labour MP for Eccles. These are the first parliamentary questions that the inquiry legal team have been able to identify from Hansard on the topic of Factor VIII supply. They were addressed to the then Secretary of State, Barbara Castle, but they were answered by her minister, Dr. Owen, on the 9th of July 1974. If we could bring up on screen, please, Paul, LDOW 5032. I believe that this is a document that Dr. Owen referred to in his evidence, certainly in his written evidence, I think in his oral evidence as well. This is a written parliamentary answer. Dr. Owen wrote this. The supply of Factor VIII produced within the National Health Service is at present insufficient for the optimum treatment of haemophilic patients. I hope that it will be possible to increase our supplies, and meanwhile product licenses were issued last year to 2 firms to market imported Factor VIII in the United Kingdom. Adequate stocks, I understand, are held of this commercial material. It is not the department's normal practice to make central purchases of health service supplies, but central contracts were arranged to facilitate the purchase of this material by health authorities. I recognise the desirability of enabling these patients to receive treatment at home, but progress in this direction is likely to depend largely on the extent to which production of Factor VIII within the National Health Service can be increased.
Just as a matter of interest, it doesn't directly affect self-sufficiency, but it may affect other points of accuracy. In her letter, Dr. Biggs speaks of 3 commercial firms, I think, whereas Dr. Owen speaks of 2. When we had the presentation in respect of pharmaceutical companies, I understood that Hemofil and Cryobalin were the 2 which were authorised to be distributed in 1973, licensed. What was the 3rd?
From memory, and I stress it is from memory, I think it was Factor VIII, Armour's Factor VIII. which came onto the
Factor
market third.
Because Profilate came later.
Yes.
Yes.
I will check on that. But
And what, because I thought the date of that was after 74, but it's plainly that's a mismemory on my part.
well, the license, I think, was after 74.
Yes.
But it was provided off license on a named patient basis.
Well, that would be so of any
Yes.
product.
Yes. From my recollection, I will check it either in the break or overnight, is that Factor 8 is the third product that enters the market.
Yes.
Rapidly
But it may not
establishes-
have been the third she was referring to if she's talking about named patient basis.
It may not be. But again, my recollection from last autumn is that Factor 8 pretty quickly establishes a very strong
Yeah.
market position, partly because it's cheaper. And
Yes.
So it may well be that Factor 8 is the one that she is referring to. Dr. Owen, in his reply there, doesn't seek to rebuff the central charges. Dr. Biggs' letter.
My own note, actually, is that Armour Factor 8 was licensed on the 25th of March 1976, which would be a couple of years after this. And Abbott's Profilate was earlier in 75. So I was just wondering if there was anything which we've missed.
I can look back, sir. I'll look at the letter and I'll see if there is anything else that can tell us which the product is that she is referring to. Dr. Owen, in his response then, not seeking to deny the central charges that Dr. Biggs had made in her letter. And seeming to accept that the question of how great a number of concentrates can be provided is tied heavily with how much domestic supply can be increased, and that is a question for the wider National Health Service, which is not inconsistent in any way with what Dr. Biggs said in her letter, that it was essentially a question of politics and finances as to why there wasn't a greater domestic supply. So we can see from this increasing tensions and increasing public concern being raised about Factor 8 supplies to patients. And in this atmosphere, the regional transfusion directors met on the 3rd of July 1974. And if we could go, please, Paul, to NHBT 0016495. We can see from a document that Dr. Maycock is in the chair and the list of regional transfusion directors. And also, we can see Dr. Waiter and Mr. Jackson from the DHSS attending. If we could turn, please, to page 4, Paul. You can see that the heading provision of plasma for antihemophilic globulin concentrate at other plasma fractions, including specific immunoglobulins. What is recorded in the minutes is this: the meeting considered Dr. Maycock's letter of the 12th of June 1974 to directors about the need to provide more plasma for fractionation, and the paper, which summarised information from Queensland, Western Australia and New South Wales, Canada and Switzerland about the number of donations collected and the use of concentrated red cells. Over to the next page. Dr. Maycock said that as a result of a number of factors that were operating or had operated, the NBTS now found itself in a position of some difficulty and facing a shortage of certain preparations of human blood. These factors, not necessarily in the order of importance, were A, the need to provide anti-haemophilic globulin concentrate equivalent to about 275,000 donations. This was the preferred preparation and was essential for home treatment, which was being increasingly used. The department had been advised that the MBTS should reach the position of being able to supply this amount of concentrate by 1975, but this was clearly not possible. B, an increasing demand throughout the world for albumin fractions. I won't go through the rest of that paragraph, sir, but I do pause to note that we, of course, are focusing on factor 8 here, but the debate about self-sufficiency is wider than that. Albumin forms a particularly important part of that debate.
What the fractionators say in their report is that either a first step or a precursor to cold ethanol fractionation is the removal from what remains of factor 8 and the proteins that tend to come with it, the proteins such as fibrinogen. Is later on in the same fractionation series that you get albumin. So presumably, but this may need a specific question, my assumption had been, and it may still be, that there's no conflict between A and B in this sense, that if you get more plasma supplied to BPL, they can make more, or get more factor 8 out of it, but they also have the supernatant, which remains in the process, from which you get more albumin. So the need to supply more plasma is essential for both, and the same plasma provides both.
That is my understanding as well.
So this is not setting up something which is a contradiction.
No.
It's basically saying we need more plasma because it will serve these various different needs.
That's right. And we will see later a group called the Working Party on Trends, when they are trying to work out how much plasma is needed to be fractionated. The measure that they take is the amount needed for albumin. And they say, if we get this amount for albumin, then it's going to be enough for factor 8 as well. So it's, as you say, it's not a contradistinction between the two. It's just you need to consider albumin as well in the wider picture, is what they're saying.
If, however, one were to use the plasma, I suppose, for cryoprecipitate production, you wouldn't have it necessarily available for albumin.
That's right, and indeed for other blood components as well. And you may remember Dr. Walford, when she was discussing the arguments about reverting to cryoprecipitate, drew attention to Dr. Lane's statement, something that we'll look at in due course, where he said, if you are going to revert to cryo, you need to think of a way to make sure that we at BPL have sufficient plasma supply in order to be able to produce albumin, factor 9, factor 13, other blood components which are not going to be covered by cryoprecipitate.
Yes.
Returning to the document at point C, and this is the third of Dr. Maycock's factors that are causing difficulties for the NBTS. He says, and I quote, "The need to depend, at least temporarily, upon supplies of AHG concentrate and possibly PPF, that's protein plasma fraction, from commercial sources, posed a potential threat to the unpaid voluntary donor system. 1. A permanent demand for commercial preparations might arise. 2. It had been suggested that MBTS should provide plasma to commercial firms for the preparation of coagulation factor concentrates which are needed by clinicians responsible for treating disorders of coagulation." I pause there, sir, to note that this is one of the first references that we have been able to find about the argument being raised that an inability to provide domestic factor VIII and albumin may threaten the very existence of a voluntary donor system in the UK. That is an argument that will be developed in the papers that we'll go on to look at. D, Dr. Maycock reported that 2 meetings between representatives of the DHSS and SHHD, Scottish Home and Health Department, have recently been held at the request of the SHHD. I skip a few sentences and it says, as a result of these meetings, the following principles have been reaffirmed. 1, the system of unpaid blood donation must be preserved in UK. 2, in order to preserve this system, the blood transfusion services in UK must be self-supported. Going on to the next page, this is a slightly different point. Dr. Maycock says, there should be agreed UK targets for provision of preparation of human blood. And there has been a discussion of Scottish targets for PPF and a discussion about why those targets were higher than those in England and Wales. Picking it back up again with the paragraph, in the present circumstances, the minutes record, quotes, in the present circumstances, increasing the number of donations used as concentrated red cells seemed to be the most practicable way of improving the amount of plasma for fractionation. In the Glasgow region, 40% of donations were used as concentrated cells. The present position in RTCs is, and then a table is set out. I won't go through all of those figures, but we can see that in comparison to Glasgow, 40% of plasma 40% of donations being split between plasma and red cells. In comparison to that, in England and Wales, the figures range from 0 in Tooting to the highest figure is 33% in Oxford. We can see, just to pick a few others, Cambridge is well below Oxford at 10%. Leeds 20%, Sheffield 6 to 7%, Bristol 25%, Cardiff 20%. In the right-hand side of that table, we can see the needs listed in order to increase the proportion of red cell concentrates, and we can see that those include staff, it says plastic equipment in respect of Newcastle, and that I take to be a reference to the fact that some of these centres were still using glass bottles to collect blood donations, which weren't conducive to separation into red cell concentrates. You needed the plastic bags to do that. Other references are to space, to the need for a centrifuge, again, references to equipment and staff, and also a reference to the need for a haematologist and 3 technical staff. So those are the reasons given by the RTCs as to what why they can't produce more in the form of red cell concentrate at that time. It's a point that we will come back to when we look at how Dr. Owen's money was spent. If we move then to the next page, page 7, the paragraph underneath number 6, the meeting concluded that the immediate aim should be to raise the use of concentrated red cells to 30 to 35%, but that in order to reach this level, additional capital and revenue expenditure would be necessary. The chairman asked RTDs to do everything they could within the limitations of their present budgets. The key points that we take from this document are as follows. Firstly, there is a reference to the donation target of 275,000 donations. And we have seen before lunch where that figure comes from. An acceptance that that would not be reached by 1975. The introduction of the new argument about the risk to the domestic voluntary donor system. So we will see that is to prove an influential argument with Dr. Owen. The emphasis that is being placed on red cell concentrates as a way of increasing plasma supply. And those final words from the minutes, that it is for the regional transfusion directors to try to do everything that they can within their budgets to increase the supply of red cell concentrates. So no central funding. This is going to have to come from the regions. The regional that was the meeting of the 3rd of July. The directors met again, regional transfusion directors, on the 9th of October 1974. I'm not going to take you to those minutes, but as is set out in the written presentation at paragraph 84, there is a sense from them of a very tense meeting and of a situation coming to a head. The meeting reported that little progress had been made on increasing red cell concentrates, and that, and I quote, progress was likely to continue to be slow until money was provided by one means or another. Mr. Jackson from the DHSS was recorded as saying, and I quote, the department was fully aware of the financial difficulties of RHAs and centres regarding factor VIII concentrate. A tense meeting and little progress being made as of October 1974. Also in the same month, the expert group on the treatment of haemophilia met again. Reference to that is made at paragraph 86 of the written presentation. I won't take you to those documents. The position that was reached by October 1974 is that we are now some 19 months after the initial meeting of the expert group on the treatment of haemophilia. The original goal of using 250,000 donations, later 275,000 donations annually for factor VIII fractionation had not been met, and it was recognised that it was not going to be met in 1975. There were also concerns over the domestic production of albumin. The more ambitious proposals put forward by Dr. Biggs and others for between 500,000 and 750,000 donations being used for fractionation were, of course, still more distant. The central call-off contract had been arranged, but regional health authorities have been slow to increase their expenditure on commercial concentrates. There had also been an unwillingness or an inability to prioritise spending to increase plasma supply to BPL. Tensions had grown between the DHSS and the regions about who should meet the additional costs, and between clinicians and the administrators about the shortfall of concentrates. Concerns were now openly being expressed about the threat to the voluntary donor system in the UK. And running through all of this was an emphasis on the lack of available funding. And that, sir, is the context in which the announcement made by Dr. Owen of £500,000 of spending took place. And it's to that we will turn. The origins of that policy announcement lie in a letter that was ultimately sent by Mr. Giddin of the DHSS, and we saw his name this morning, to regional administrative officers. There's a string of correspondence within the DHSS when the letter is drafted and redrafted and thoughts are given on it. I'm going to take you to the letter now. This is what results from all of these discussions, and it is at CBLA 40239. I'm going to read all of this letter, sir, because this ultimately is the document that Dr. Owen approves, which amounts to the approval for the spending of £500,000 of central funds from the DHSS. The letter, addressed to regional administrators and dated the 24th of December 1974, says this: blood products production. The National Blood Transfusion Service is currently unable to meet the demands of clinicians for certain preparations of human blood. There is an immediate need to provide more AHG concentrate, equivalent to about 275,000 blood donations annually. AHG concentrate is now the preferred therapeutic agent for the treatment of haemophilia, and considerable benefit could be brought to these patients if adequate supplies could be made available for their treatment. There is also an increasing demand for albumin fractions, mainly plasma protein fraction, PPF, which is replacing dried plasma and plasma substitutes. Over the next few years, the need for PPF may rise to 200,000 bottles per annum. At present, part of the demand for these blood products is being met by expensive imported material, which is now marketed in this country. And as the demand increases, commercial firms may consider it worth their while to establish panels of paid donors in this country in order to obtain their supplies of human blood. Such a development would constitute a most serious threat to the voluntary donor system upon which the NBTS is founded. The Department therefore regards it as of the greatest importance, quite apart from the question of cost, that the NHS should become self-sufficient as soon as practicable in the production of PPF and other blood products. The cost of purchasing AHG and PPF from commercial firms on the scale envisaged in paragraph 1 would be around £6 million a year. The current output from the Blood Products Laboratory, Elstree, is limited by the amount of plasma supplied by regional transfusion centres, RTCs. This amount, in turn, depends upon A, the number of blood donations collected and the extent to which clinicians are prepared to use blood in the form of concentrated red cells, and B, the facilities available at RTCs for separation of whole blood into concentrated red cells and plasma. At present, less than 10% of blood donations in England and Wales are used in the form of concentrated red cells, compared with 30 to 40% in Scotland. If this percentage could be raised to 40% in England and Wales, it would be possible for the NHS to meet the demand for AHG concentrate and to increase the production of PPF from the current figure of 78,000 bottles to 136,000 bottles. To reach the medium-term target of 200,000 bottles of PPF per annum, mentioned in paragraph 1, would also require an increase of 400,000 blood donations from the present figure of 1.6 million per annum. It is intended that the production of blood products in Great Britain should be coordinated, and that some of the increased output of plasma produced in RTCs in England and Wales should, by arrangement with the Scottish Home and Health Department, be processed at the Plasma Fractionation Centre, Liberton, Edinburgh. To achieve a 40% use of concentrated red cells will require the full cooperation of clinicians. Clearly, no steps can be taken towards this objective unless parallel action is taken to ensure that RTCs have sufficient facilities to separate more plasma from whole blood, and thus to meet the increased usage of concentrated red cells. For this purpose, the cost of providing the necessary facilities, such as additional equipment and staff, might be up to £0.5 million in England and Wales, part of it recurring. The cost of collecting 400,000 additional donations annually might be of the order to a further £1 to £1.5 million. The extent to which the capacities of RTCs to produce plasma can be increased will vary from centre to centre. It would clearly be considerably cheaper to produce these blood products within the NHS than to buy them from commercial sources. If the normal procedure for financing of health services were to be followed, authorities would need to agree collectively to accord blood transfusion priority for additional resources over a period of several years within a coordinated programme of expansion. However, additional expenditure is bound to be somewhat disproportionate as between regions if realistic targets are adopted with the aim of making NHS production sufficient to meet clinical needs. It has, therefore, been decided that since the department would in any case have to coordinate a programme for the increased production of blood products, earmarked finance of up to £0.5 million should exceptionally be provided for this purpose. The department proposed to invite estimates of requirements in RTCs for the increased production of plasma, with the primary aim of making the NHS self-sufficient in AHG concentrate in 2 to 3 years. Additional copies of this letter are enclosed for the Regional Medical Officer, the Regional Treasurer and the Regional Transfusion Director. And it is signed by Mr. Giddon. The letter and the internal DHSS correspondence that was circulated during the drafting of the letter indicate that this programme is something of a hybrid between national and regional funding. The decision is made, and is stressed to be an exceptional decision, to provide £500,000 of central DHSS funding in order to increase the production of blood products with the aim of self-sufficiency in 2 to 3 years. The terms of the letter, the reference in the letter to the immediate need to achieve 275,000 donations for concentrate, refer back to the immediate target as set out by the MRC, rather than the longer-term, medium and longer-term targets by the MRC, which were of 500 to 750,000 donations per year. The reference is to a sum of £500,000 coming from central government. In order to expand plasma production further, there would be a need for continuing funding. And the hope within the DHSS was that the £500,000 would meet initial costs and that the regional health authorities would then be persuaded to invest further in order to avoid the costs of the more expensive commercial concentrate in the future. To give a couple of pieces of correspondence which evidence that, in June 1976, the DHSS official then leading the initiative, Timothy Dutton, described the provision of central funds, the £500,000, in the following terms. The reference, I won't take you to it, but the reference is DHSC 0103-283_102. Mr. Dutton said that this was, and I quote, a pump priming operation to start the AHG concentrate plasma production programme. Thereafter, it was expected that regions would continue the programme from within their normal allocations, which include an element for the programme, revised in the usual way to take account of cost increases. Back in 1974, Dr. Waiter described the rationale behind the £500,000 proposal in the following terms, and I quote, "It is an initial injection of money by whatever mechanism is now available to ensure such a programme will get underway. At present, it shows little likelihood of so doing." The reference of that is DHSC 303616_038. So both Dr. Waiter and Mr. Dutton see this as essentially a way of kick-starting production or increased production of plasma for fractionation. The exceptionality of this central funding, which Mr. Giddon was at pains to stress in the letter to the regional health authorities, was also something that was referred to by Dr. Maycock in 1976 in a document about in which he provides comments on a paper about decision-making structures in the MBTS. Dr. Maycock says this: while it is true that the department, that's the DHSS, can, if it wishes, provide additional money for regional health authorities and direct how it should be used, I think it is important that the reader of the paper understand that the department has, for some 20 years, rarely, if ever, used this ability, although there would have been occasions when to have done so would have enabled simultaneous and uniform advances to be made. To the best of my knowledge, the ability has been used only for AHG, and then only after prolonged and vigorous prodding. That's Dr. Maycock looking back in 1976 for references DHSC 303738_047. The reference to prolonged and vigorous prodding is an interesting one. We have seen in those RTD, Regional Transfusion Directors meeting minutes, the tensions that were growing up in the second part of 1974, that the policy is announced only towards the end of that year when those tensions have built up. The letter from Mr. Giddin goes out on the 24th of December 1974, and it does so after Dr. Owen becomes involved in the debate and gives his authority to this policy. The earliest reference that we can find to his involvement is in a document. If we could go to this, please, Paul. DHSC 01/00005_189. This is a minute to Mr. Alexander, who I understand to have been Dr. Owen's private secretary, and it comes from Mr. Giddin. It is dated the 9th of December 1974. It says at paragraph 1, "Since Dr. Raisin and I discussed with the Minister of State last week the question of supplies of AHG concentrate, we have established within the office that earmarked central finance to the extent of £0.25 million capital and £0.25 million revenue could be made available to regional authorities to increase NHS production of this material. We've been asked to draw attention to the fact that a decision to make this special allocation of resources to blood products production inevitably means that less money overall will be available for other high-priority health authority services, e.g. mentally ill, mentally handicapped, family planning, and certain centrally sponsored projects such as schemes to reduce waiting times. But there is broad agreement that such an allocation would be justifiable. The minute then goes on to suggest a form of words that could be used in answer to questions which have been raised by several MPs on this point, which shows the political pressure that was building for a policy development on this front as well. And if we could go over to paragraph 3, please. It will be necessary to inform regional authorities of this decision, and I attach for information a rather fuller draft of a Dear Sir letter, which I suggest should issue at about the same time as the Minister of State's letter to MPs. I pause there to note that that is a draft of the letter that was eventually sent out by Mr. Giddens. During our discussion last week, mention was made of a possible arranged parliamentary question, which could be based on the last 3 paragraphs of the draft above. I am somewhat doubtful about this, since the main pressure is for additional money to buy the commercial product now. However, you will no doubt take the Minister of State's view on this. That is signed by Mr. Giddens, dated 9th of December 1974, so the reference to the previous week means that Dr. Owen was involved in discussing this policy in early December 1974. Also, perhaps of note, the political pressures to which Mr. Giddens is alluding are to buy commercial concentrate straight away rather than to take a longer-term development of domestic production. The response from Dr. Owen comes in a minute from Mr. Alexander to Mr. Giddens on the 11th of December 1974. This is DHSC 01-00005_191. Mr. Alexander wrote this, and I quote, Dr. Owen has seen your minute of the 9th of December 1974 and has agreed the submission. He would like one change made to the suggested new standard reply for MPs. In place of the second paragraph you propose, he would like inserted suitably amended versions of the first and second paragraphs of a draft letter to regional administrators, which you also submitted for approval. He has commented that, and I quote, it is time MPs knew the full arguments. He would like to know if there is any objection to this. With reference to paragraph 4 of your minute, Dr. Owen has commented, I agree that we should not court publicity. Picking up the last point first, that is about whether or not there should be a planted parliamentary question to make the announcement, Dr. Owen says no. The reference to the fuller draft, including the second paragraph of the letters to the regional administrators, that is a reference to the risk to the voluntary donor system, which Dr. Owen suggests should be put in the replies to MPs as well as being sent to the regional administrators. In response to that, Mr. Giddens advises Dr. Owen not to do that. He says that the reason for that advice is to avoid controversy, and because he was aware that there were some advocates within the UK who were suggesting that the voluntary donor system should be perhaps replaced or at least supplemented with paid donors. And Mr. Giddens, the tenor of Mr. Giddens' advice is let's not go there. Let's not raise this issue. Dr. Owen accepts that advice, and we can see his response at LDOW 40344, please, Paul. This is 17th of December 1974 from Mr. Alexander and sent to Mr. Brands. It says, Dr. Owen has seen Mr. Giddens' minute of the 13th of December 1974, that's one I've just summarised, about the standard draft letter to MPs, on the treatment of haemophilia. He has said that he will accept this advice. Dr. Owen has gone on to comment more widely on related issues, and this is a quotation from Lord Owen. I would like, however, the department to consider a legislative ban on paid donor panels for blood and semen and indeed any human biological material. He discusses a way in which such a ban could be put into legislation. The philosophy and spirit of Richard Titmus's book, The Gift Relationship, is one to which I attach immense importance. The concept of altruism is one which government should not be neutral over, but actively promote. I will never be party to the National Blood Transfusion Service not being available to all. And Mr. Alexander goes on to ask for a note on the points raised by Dr. Owen. We know, sir, from Dr. Owen's evidence that he had reviewed the gift relationship back in 1971, and Dr. Owen stressed in his evidence the importance that he attached to the idea of a voluntary donor system within the United Kingdom. Those were the internal discussions about the policy. As we have seen, they led to the letter being sent out to the regional administrators on the 24th of December 1974. In terms of public announcements, the first that we have been able to find is on the 22nd of January 1975, and it is a written response to a parliamentary question. And if we could go, please, Paul, to DHSC 40274. Towards the bottom right of that page, under the heading haemophilia, the question has come from Mr. George Cunningham, asking the Secretary of State for Social Services what deficiency exists in the supply of factor 8 brackets cryoprecipitate for the treatment of haemophilia, and what action she proposes to take to deal with the problem. That is a reference to Barbara Castle. Dr. Owen provides the answer. He wrote, the amount of factor 8 materials, including cryoprecipitate, produced within the National Health Service is not sufficient, and in particular, there is an immediate need to provide more human anti-haemophilic globulin concentrate, AHG concentrate, which is now the preferred treatment for haemophiliac patients. There is also an increasing demand for certain other blood fractions. At present, part of the demand for AHG concentrate is being met by imported material, but this is very expensive. Go over to the next page, please. And for reasons which I well understand, health authorities feel they cannot afford to buy as much as they would wish to, given the various claims on their resources. I believe it is vitally important that the National Health Service should become self-sufficient as soon as practicable in the production of factor 8, including AHG concentrate. This will stop us being dependent on imports and make the best-known treatment more readily available to people suffering from haemophilia. I have, therefore, authorised the allocation of special finance to boost our own production with the objective of becoming self-sufficient over the next few years. That is, so far as we can tell, the first announcement of the policy. Dr. Owen was asked about factor 8 again in oral questions on the 25th of February 1975, and he was pushed to commit to central purchasing of what was described as this drug and to home treatment. And if we could go, please, to HSOC 0015202, we can see how he responded to that. He says first, I have authorised the allocation of special finance of up to £500,000, about half of which would be recurring, to increase the existing production of factor VIII, especially in the form of anti-haemophilic globulin concentrate, AHG, within the National Health Service. The first effects of this will, I hope, be felt by the end of the year. Mr. Watkinson, who is asking the questions, welcomes the reply and then goes on to talk about the need for central purchasing. He also asks if Dr. Owen will accept that this is far and away the best treatment for haemophilia. Dr. Owen responds by saying this, and I quote, "I confirm that in most cases, I think it is the most desirable form of treatment, but one cannot avoid the fact that this is one of the many costly treatments which are competing on priorities. The present system, whereby a doctor can persuade his local area health authority that his patient needs this form of treatment most, is the best way of proceeding, and not by central allocation. If we were to go to all commercial purchase of this factor, it would cost an additional £1.5 to £2 million annually." And if we could go back to the full screen, Paul, thank you. A further question is asked by Mr. Martin with particular reference to the undertreatment of children. And he asks whether or not Dr. Owen can go a stage further and give more of a lead to regional health authorities. Dr. Owen replies by saying this, and I quote, "They are aware of our concern and have ample demonstration of it by the fact that we are prepared to divert scarce resources to make the National Health Service self-sufficient. But I concede that it will take 2 or 3 years before we are at full production. During that time, I am sure that they will weigh very carefully the individual cases and will be sympathetic to the sort of hardship which can arise." And Mr. Shaw asks a further question where he compares the position in the UK to that in Israel. And Dr. Owen says, and I quote, "I know my honourable friend's concern, but honourable members must face the fact that with limited resources, we have to choose. And these are very difficult choices and priorities. When confronted with an ill child, everyone wants to get the best that is available, but there are many other aspects of childcare which also have priority, and we are not always able to meet all the demands." That is the 25th of February 1975. And I stress again, those are oral answers to questions, whereas the previous section of Hansard was a written answer. On the following day, the 26th of February 1975, Dr. Owen published some further written answers to parliamentary questions. I won't take you to these, but the questions included concerns over the provision of concentrates and about domestic production. Dr. Owen repeated his previous comments on the £500,000 which had been made available, and I quote, "to increase the existing production of factor VIII within the National Health Service." He noted the expense of the commercial products and the resultant reluctance of regional health authorities to buy them. And he then stated, and I quote, "I believe that it is vitally important that the National Health Service should become self-sufficient as soon as practicable in the production of factor VIII, including AHG concentrate. This will stop our being dependent on imports and make the best-known treatment more readily available to people suffering from haemophilia." Those are the answers that he gave in January and February 1975. There is no reference in those answers or in Mr. Giddens' letter to the regional administrators to any perceived safety advantage of domestically produced concentrates when compared to commercial concentrates. I'm about to move on, sir, to how that £500,000 was spent and what was achieved by it and what was said about it. And I wonder if it would now be a good time to have a break and come back to that.
Yes, we'll take a break for 25 minutes and come back at 20 to 4. 20 to 4.